Hi, everyone. I'm Alex Usher, and this is the World of Higher Education podcast. Student mobility is big business. Behind the process of getting students to apply to and then attend a university or college thousands of miles away from home is an industry that's worth billions of dollars a year. And one of the OGs of that industry is a company called IDP, which grew out of an Australian government scheme beginning in 1969, which for the first 37 years of its existence was owned by a consortium of Australian universities. Over the decades, IDP diversified away from simple student recruitment in a number of ways. It also left university control about 20 years ago and evolved into a publicly listed company on the Melbourne Stock Exchange, which at one point was worth over $10 billion. Few companies have had a better view of the explosion of international student enrollment in Anglosphere countries over the past decade, and few have been more exposed as one by one those countries began to turn away international students over the past 3 years. With me today to talk about all things IDP and student mobility is IDP's Christine Wach. She's IDP's Senior Vice President of Partnerships and Stakeholder Engagement. We cover a lot in this interview, from the company's historical evolution to the current state of the international education market, who the new big players are, and how the market will evolve over the next few years. It's an interesting blend of past and future from an observer who's had lots of time to think about both. And so without further ado, let's turn things over to Christine. Christine, tell us about how IDP started. Why did Australian universities feel the need to create a joint service to recruit students abroad? Why didn't, everyone else in the world just goes out individually and does it? Why did they do it differently?
Yeah, great question. So I think IDP has a pretty interesting origin story. We were started by the Australian government in 1969 as the Australian Asian Universities Cooperation Scheme, AAUCS. And initially, we were really just focused on skills exchange programs with academics from Southeast Asia and Australia in the areas specifically of agriculture and food science. So at the time, we were a not-for-profit, and this was all in collaboration with the Australian universities. Our initial goal was really to build capacity with Australia's Southeast Asian neighbors. And over that time, this work developed into a broader sort of international education mission. In 1981, we actually transitioned and became the International Development Program, or IDP. IDP Education as we're known today. And it wasn't really until 1986 that we shifted our model to a more commercially focused student placement business, which, one of the things we're most famous for today. When the Australian government changed the rules to enable international students to study in Australian universities at scale. So given we already had a strong university collaboration at our core, it was a very natural link to become a leading student placement provider, formerly known as agent, for students to come to Australia. I think over the years we've grown, our model has evolved to cater to more destinations, but through it all, our purpose has remained consistent. So at the heart of everything we do is to support students and to really transform people's lives through international education.
So you were started by government, and your clients, I guess, were universities, but eventually you became, as you say, an independent corporation. How did that happen?
So the shift happened gradually as we expanded from a university consortium initiative into a large-scale international education services organization. As our footprint grew, IDP needed more flexibility and we needed more capital to invest in new markets, tech, operations, and capabilities, I think, that are really harder to build under a purely sector-owned structure. A major milestone for us is when we listed on the Australian Securities Exchange, or ASX. That was in 2015, which really helped
that
us.
late. I thought that was much earlier. Okay.
No, it's only 11 years ago, and that helped fund growth. And it really positioned us for global scale. Some universities still remain shareholders today in IDP.
So you're not fully, so in a sense, you're public, but you still have significant institutional shareholding.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Got it. But you were growing quite big before 2015. So were there key events that made IDP what it is sort of before the IPO? Like, what were the things that really pushed you to become the kind of, big multinational company that you are?
Yeah. I think there's so many milestones in our history, given that we're almost 60 years old, but I'm going to call out a few that I think have really defined us the most. So in 1989, we established IELTS, and we co-own IELTS with the British Council and Cambridge University in the UK. So we know this has gone on to become the world's sort of most trusted and largest English test for migration, high stakes migration and academic study. In 2009, we shifted away from just a focus in Australia and began to support students to study in other destinations. So originally the second destination was the US, but now we send students to the US, Canada, the UK, Ireland, New Zealand, and more recently, we've just launched Malaysia as a destination.
Okay.
Yeah. So this is really key to who we are today. And our commitment is still to place students in the right country, right program, right course, right school to set them up for success. In 2017, we acquired the Hot Courses Group, which really boosted our digital capability and shifted us from that bricks and mortar company to a multi-channel experience, which we're known for today.
Mhm.
And then in more recent years, you've seen we've evolved how we deliver the IELTS test, changed our models for how we connect and support students, and we've introduced new service lines. So we've got things like Student Essentials, which is designed to support students once they arrive in a destination country with things like accommodation, banking, insurance, etc. And then recently, obviously, we're needing to shift and we're shifting to become more AI enabled, flexible, given the fast changing market that we're in right now. Though, of course, we are shifting and we're AI enabled, we're still at the core of IDP is we keep the human connection and that student support central to everything we do.
I'll come back to the AI thing in a second, but so your big lines of business right now, IELTS, student mobility, I guess you view Hot Courses as a separate line of business, or is that
Yeah, I mean, yes and no. I mean, the Hot Courses site still exists, IDP Hot Courses, but we integrate them as a service for our clients. So it's
okay?
all a part of IDP, but initially it was run separately and now it's,
Right.
emerged into the IDP world.
And would you call those your three main areas of business? Are there any others that we haven't touched on yet?
Yeah, I mean, I think the two largest and main lines of business are student placement, traditional student placement, and language testing. So we also have marketing services, which would include that Hot Courses, and data and research services, which we call IQ services. So that's where you see, like right now, we're releasing Emerging Futures 9 research, which is our student research.
Mhm.
That team based in London in the UK manages all that. We have smaller lines of business too, language teaching in Southeast Asia, and some UK specific services for the UK domestic university market.
That's pretty diversified. So how does AI fit into all that? Is it AI just something that you're helping in terms of the marketing and the student placement, or does it have a more horizontal effect across a larger percentage of your businesses?
Yeah, I think the latter. I mean, from our student surveys, we know that, of course, students are using AI in their search. Research is showing us that 60% of searches are zero-click searches right now. So meaning they don't end up landing on a website. So that's transforming all aspects of our business. And then I think operationally, internally, we're using AI-enabled services in our student counseling. With language testing, we're doing a lot of research and development in this area. And yeah, so horizontally across everything.
Interesting. Christine, I want to turn now to, market conditions in the last few years, because it's been a roller coaster, right? And not just here in Canada, it's been quite. So 2021, 2022, we saw a huge explosion of international students right across the Anglosphere, right? So US, Canada, UK, Australia, New Zealand. Well, not New Zealand in 21, but anyway, the big jumps in numbers post-COVID.
Yeah.
Now, I know why supply increased, right? Like there were more universities who wanted to accept international students because it was more money. But what was behind the increase in demand? Why did hundreds of thousands of students suddenly decide they had to study abroad? Because that's the half I never see spoken about very much. What's your guess?
Yeah. I mean, we were talking about this just before this podcast. I think there's a few things. So just obviously the rising global mobility, skills-driven career pathways, perhaps the digitization of student decision-making, students, how much they were able to research, compare more options online. There was increased demand, I think, for higher quality institutions and really practical options available in the major English-speaking destinations. But I think there's a connection to migration that people weren't talking about before COVID started. So I think that for the first time after the pandemic, we started talking about migration and education together. During the pandemic, provincial governments and institutions here in Canada started to work closely aligned policies to allow students to enter Canada. I mean, so I think this really contributed to that huge growth and that demand, and students seeing the opportunity. We look at our research with students, ROI, as it pertains to employment, whether it's cooperative education, internships, and post-study work or post-grad work permits, are driving factors for students and parents. And I think that opportunity to study in the big four destinations was driven largely because of this.
Staying on the subject of that sort of explosion of international
Mhm.
students in 21, 22, 23, do you think that universities and colleges in the Anglosphere actually did right by that big explosion of international students? I mean, the students want a quality experience, but there were so many people coming into the country for
Mhm.
education. And I'm not just talking about Canada. UK was arguably a bigger case. Did we manage to supply a quality experience to all these students, or did our institutions fall short? And if so, why?
So I think in many places, quality did hold up, but obviously rapid growth exposed a lot of the capacity constraints. So first of all, I think a lot of institutions genuinely did care and do care and worked hard, especially supporting students arriving into a post-pandemic environment, perhaps even when they'd been onboarded in their home country. So second, I think when the volume grew faster, or when it grows faster than accommodation, than staffing, than local services, students feel it most in areas like housing affordability, which we saw, wait times for support, consistency of onboarding, well-being services, job opportunities. And so I think the lesson is that sustainable growth needs to be coordinated and planning so that enrollment settings, housing supplies, student supports all scale together. I think this is consistent. So talking about our research, Emerging Futures 9, students are weighing destinations more carefully, with things like cost of living and value playing a bigger role in decision making. So like that lived experience of the students, especially in areas like housing, becomes central to the reputation and the long-term demand for a destination or an institution.
Mm. So obviously we know the bubble burst across the Anglosphere in
Mhm.
23 and 2024. In the sense that receiving countries, those with lots of international students, they started becoming less welcoming. You know, it, it's been of different severity in different countries. Canada's been a lot,
Mhm.
the shutdown has been much more complete here than it was in either the UK or Australia. But it's all, kind of the same thing. And at the
Mhm.
same time, we started seeing really big increases in international student numbers in some very odd places, right? Like not just, Germany and France where you might expect it, but
Mhm.
Turkey, South Korea, Kazakhstan, Bulgaria. I can't remember. I did a list last year of like how many countries said 2025 was their record year, and it was
Right.
big, right? And I know in the higher education press, people often suggest that, well, these are smaller countries picking up students who can't go to the big four Anglophone countries. Is that true? Like, are these the same? Is this seriously just a diversion? Like, we say no and they go somewhere else? Or are these countries attracting a different type of student from a different set of countries and a different set of markets and programs?
Yeah, I don't think it's entirely that there's simply it's partly true. I don't think it's entirely true. They're not just picking up students who can't access the major Anglophones. I think there's some substitution, when the policies tighten here in Canada,
Yeah.
the US, or when costs rise in a major Anglophone direction. I don't think we can forget about price as a driving factor. Some students who are flexible on destination will shift to alternatives, especially if they offer. I think clarity is a big thing in terms of visa processing and speed, faster visas, right? Lower costs, and then clearer work options. I think we're also seeing some genuinely different segments emerge. I mean, some students choose continental Europe for affordability or expanded English taught options. We're seeing a lot of that. Others choose parts of Asia for scholarships, proximity to their home. I think strong innovation brands we see. Some consider and are considering like T&E routes.
Yep.
In EF9, that's Emerging Futures 9, I keep referring to it. So we see this broadening, the students' willingness to look at this, as we're calling it the Big 14 now. They are comparing multiple pathways and markets. And I think transnational education is no longer viewed just as sort of the cheap option, but as a route to employability and sometimes onward study, though I'm not sure that that's going to work for all institutions to invest in
Mm,
that. And that's got a very long horizon, I think, many years to see that flourish, I think, for
yeah.
some institutions. But yeah, I think, there's a lot of questions. Are the programs offered in English? What's the cost, et cetera, et cetera? But a lot of these emerging desperate, as you said, they're not really new, like Germany and France. They've been attracting students for a long time. So they have important relationships across the globe. But I think it's just more apparent now that you see all the visa lack of clarity and
Yeah.
geopolitics and what's going on in the US.
Yeah. Or in the case of branch campuses in Dubai, whether there are bombs falling, right? I mean, like
That's right. Yeah.
security, that whole equation's changed quite a bit in the last few months.
Yeah, absolutely.
So these are some pretty big changes in student mobility. How does it affect IDP? I mean, obviously you say you're moving into Malaysia. I would guess that's one consequence, right, of the recent changes. But are your fortunes kind of indifferent to where students go, or does the shift away from Anglophone countries affect your bottom line disproportionately?
So yeah, I mean, IDP is diversified across destinations and services. So we're not tied to a single country in a way, that a mono destination model might be. But policies in major destinations still matter because they influence the volume. The conversion is a big thing, not just the volume of applications, but what's converting. And then student confidence in that destination. Our research, again, students want clarity. They need to know that they don't like this constant changing landscape. So we use our research, our insights, including our own, Emerging Futures 9 to understand where student preferences are heading, which destinations are gaining consideration, what factors like cost, safety, work rights, employability are shaping students' and parents' decisions. When a large market tightens rules or signals uncertainty, demand shifts. So
Right.
we have that advantage, obviously. And that shows up in student placement volumes and related services. It also shows up in our IELTS data. Where do we see people choosing that they're going to go in, 24 months or 18 months out, and volumes of language testing students. So yeah, the short answer is we're somewhat insulated by our diversity, but we're not completely immune, just like anyone.
Yeah.
And as you said, look at our Malaysia new destination, which we're excited about, is an example of this.
Yeah, and IELTS, I imagine, is much more insulated from change than your student mobility stuff too, right? Because it doesn't matter where they're going, they need IELTS.
They need IELTS. Yeah,
Yeah,
they do. They
yeah,
need a
okay,
language test. And, it's still impacted, but it's global. So
yeah, yeah.
yeah.
Walk me through how you think the next 4 or 5 years will play out. I mean, who knows what's going to go on in the U.S. and who knows how what policy changes will happen here. The UK, certainly political instability looks like it might affect international students. And do you think international student numbers are likely to come back in the Anglophone world? And if not, who in there is best placed to grab new students? I have seen a few countries just sort of say flat out, we're going to replace falling domestic student numbers with the international students. The higher education minister in Poland said that a couple of weeks ago. And I remember thinking, they're all going to run up against exactly the same problem we did in Canada, right? Which is they're
Yeah.
not going to do it in a coordinated fashion. You're going to run into housing problems, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
who's best placed to avoid messing up the way Canada messed up if things don't return in Anglophone countries?
Well, I think the things will return. I think depends on the country, I guess. For the Anglophone countries, we think that the next 4 or 5 years are going to be defined by a more managed growth. Canada is obviously, the focus on quality, the focus on the U15. All the universities, and of
we
course,
can't go down,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
Like there's no falling below.
Well, no. We're at the bottom. Hopefully, we're at the lowest point. And we are seeing signs of interest and improving visa conversion rates. And, I met with the U15 the other day in Toronto, and they're seeing the same. So I'm actually optimistic about Canada. But again, I think it's quality, managed growth. And a couple of weeks ago in Ottawa, everyone was talking about global talent connected to economic outcomes. So much more structured. I think most of this change is actually good for Canada, but it's time for us to grow again. So underlying demand remains strong, we think. I think the big swing factor is going to be policy stability. So that's where the US, less certainty. Students and families respond very quickly to uncertainty in visa rules, work rights, and cost of living. but especially the visa rules and work rights. And we're seeing that in a major way in the US right now. Our survey, EF9, students shows, once again, they're shopping globally more than ever. So 78% are seriously considering more than one destination. So we're just going to continue to see the growth shared across a wider set of markets. I think that's important for universities and regions to keep in mind when they're looking at how they're marketing. They can't do it the way they used to do it. They need to be much more specific and bold in their marketing. But interestingly, the EF9 still shows that Big Four destinations remain the top first choices. They seem to own that space of career confidence. Students and parents trust they will deliver on what they've promised to in the past. And that the key ROIs are, that employability, post-grad work permits, all the stuff we're talking about, safety, stable rules, etc. So for the new destinations, any country that scales quickly without coordinated planning is going to feel pressure, like you said, just like we did. I think the difference is, can the governments and institutions align enrollment with accommodation strategies, local infrastructures, student supports, so that growth is, intentional and sustainable? I think that's what Canada needs to do, what all the destinations need to do.
Christine, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Alex. My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And it just remains for me to thank our excellent producers, Tiffany McLennan, Sam Puvek, and you, our listeners and readers, for joining us. If you have any questions or comments about today's episode or suggestions for future ones, please don't hesitate to get in touch with us at podcast@higheredstrategy.com. Join me next week when our guest will be Marcel Levy. He's president of the executive board of the Dutch National Research Council, or NWO. We'll be talking mainly about the work of the Dutch Knowledge Coalition, of which the NWO is a part, in the recent national general elections, and also how countries like the Netherlands are positioning research and talent as key drivers of economic competitiveness. Bye for now.